We're introducing today the Auto Stock for Every Taxpayer Act to require the Treasury to distribute to individual taxpayers all the stock in the new GM and Chrysler within 1 year following the emergence of the new GM from bankruptcy proceedings. This is the best way to get the auto companies out of the hands of Washington bureaucrats and politicians and into the hands of the American people in the marketplace where it belongs. So instead of the Treasury owning 60% of the shares in the new GM and 8% of the shares of Chrysler, you would own them if you were one of about 120 million Americans who paid federal taxes on April 15. This is the fastest way to get the stock out of the hands of Washington and back into the hands of the American people who paid for it. To keep it simple and to help the little guy also get an ownership stake in America's future, Treasury would give each taxpayer an equal number of the available shares. The Treasury Department has said it wants to sell the shares as soon as it can, but the president of General Motors said in a phone call with a number of us in Congress a couple of days ago that this is a very large amount of stock and that an orderly offering of the shares might take several years. These shares might not be worth very much at first, but put them away and one day they might contribute something to a college education. For example, General Motors' 610 million shares were worth only about 75 cents just before bankruptcy, but they were worth $40 a couple of years before that and $75 a few years before that. Already we're beginning to see what government ownership of car companies looks like. Yesterday, the presidents of GM and Chrysler spent 4 hours before congressional committees talking about dealerships. I assume they drove themselves here in congressionally approved methods of transportation, probably their own hybrid cars. That meant they didn't have any time yesterday to design cars, to build cars, or to sell cars. Unless we get the stock out of the hands of Washington, this is going to be repeated over and over and over and over again. There are at least 60 committees and subcommittees in Washington who can summon the heads of the auto companies here to give them advice about how to do their job. Car companies executives who ought to be managing complex companies will be reduced to the status of an assistant secretary, moving from subcommittee to subcommittee, hauling briefing books. You can just imagine what the questions will be next week. What's the next model going to be? What color will the paint be? Which plant should be closed? Why don't you open one in my congressional district? How many cars should have flex fuel? What should the work rules be at the Flint plant? What should the salaries be in the executive offices? Where can conferences be held? Someone will want to know why the GM Volt, is buying a battery made in South Korea instead of in that congressman's congressional districts. There will be lengthy questions about the number of holidays, thousands of written questions demanding thousands of written answers, all of it under oath. So lots of lawyers will need to be involved. And it's not just the Congress that we have to worry about. The president's already called the mayor of Detroit and assured him that he's on his side in keeping the headquarters of GM in Detroit so the executives won't move it to Warren, Michigan. And the mayor of Detroit has said he's had plenty of conversations with members of the president's auto task force who've assured him they're on his side as well. Then there's the Treasury Secretary and then the undersecretaries who want to keep up with what's happening to the taxpayers' $50 billion. There's a very active economic czar in the White House who used to be the president of Harvard. There are the EPA officials who will want to be telling them what size cars to build. And it was not very long ago that the administration told General Motors it was building too many SUVs and that its Volt was too expensive to work, and then the president himself fired the president of General Motors. So giving the stock to the taxpayers who actually paid for it is the only way to get the government out of the company's hair and give them a chance to succeed. And it will create an investor fan base of 120 million or so Americans who are now stockholders in those companies, who may be a little more interested in what the next model Chevy might be. Think fan base of the Green Bay Packers, whose ownership is distributed among the people of Green Bay. This is the fastest way to get back to the wise principle If you can find it in the yellow pages, the government ought not to be doing it. More than the money, it's the principle of the thing. The other day, a visiting European automotive executive said to me with a laugh that he had come to the, quote, New American Automotive Center, Washington, D.C. To get our economy moving again, let's get our auto companies out of the hands of Washington politicians and bureaucrats and back into the marketplace and the hands of American investors. The sooner, the better.
When Lamar described this amendment that he has just described to you, I said I have an amendment that will fit perfectly. And so I have joined my amendment to his, and we will be offering it as the Alexander Bennett Amendment, or as I suppose it will be known in Utah, the Bennett-Alexander Amendment. There will obviously be a period of time before the stock can be distributed. He's anticipated roughly a year. In that period of a year, the Secretary of the Treasury will be in charge of controlling this stock. So my amendment will give the Secretary of Treasury, my portion of this amendment, will give the Secretary of the Treasury the same fiduciary responsibility that any director or official in a company would have. Now, we talk about conflict of interest here in Washington a great deal, and a conflict of interest is not a good thing. The Secretary of the Treasury finds himself in a position of conflict of interest. He has his interest as the chief financial officer, if you will, of the federal government, and conflict of that with his position running an auto company, or at least overseeing the running of an auto company. The President of the United States has said, we don't want to run an auto company. And so I say, good on you, Mr. President. We will set up a circumstance with this amendment where the Secretary of the Treasury has a responsibility to the shareholders, the same as if he were a CEO or a member of the board of directors of a private company. And therefore, in discharging that fiduciary responsibility, we have removed the conflict of interest. We've made it clear that he will be subject to the same kinds of laws and regulations, and yes, perhaps shareholder lawsuits, that anyone would be in a position of fiduciary responsibility of a company. I think by doing that, I will spur the desire of the Secretary of the Treasury to comply with Senator Alexander's part of the amendment and get rid of this stock as fast as he possibly can. And giving it to the American people who have paid for it strikes me as a good idea. Now, another portion of my amendment says no more TARP money can go to a bankrupt company. The TARP money was sold to the Congress as acquiring assets, not as acquiring stock positions in various companies, and particularly not in acquiring a stock position in a bankrupt manufacturing company. When we approved TARP the first time around, we did it with the understanding that it was dealing with the credit crisis and the financial meltdown that we were facing around the world. And instead, the TARP money has gone into these bankrupt companies. And once again, to the question of conflict of interest, I'm saying there must be no conflict of interest with respect to how the TARP money is being spent, so that the Treasury Secretary says, well, wearing my hat, looking out for the benefits of General Motors, I'm going to suddenly switch and take my hat as the Treasury Secretary and determine that some TARP money is going to go to relieve my problems as an executive overseeing the auto companies. So those are the two aspects of the addition that I am making to Senator Alexander's amendment. Number one, we're giving the Secretary of the Treasury the same kind of fiduciary responsibility and therefore exposure that any officer or director would have of a corporate opportunity. And at the same time, we're saying no more TARP money, Mr. Secretary. Whichever hat you may be wearing can go to one of the bankrupt auto companies. Senator Kyle has joined us.
I support the Kyle Bennett. No, I'm just teasing. I am proud to be a co-sponsor of the Alexander Bennett Amendment because they joined two excellent ideas together in something that I think is critical. First of all, understand American people are really fed up with this notion of the federal government taking over businesses and running those businesses. And part of this is in a response to that, but there is a very good governance aspect of this that I want to bring to your attention. You know, the government in the United States of America is made up of the people. The people came first. It's we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, get together and give the government some of our rights, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So the people are the government in the United States. When we talk about the government owning something, it's the people who own it. And so it's the people who should have the shares of stocks, not the government. And that's the first great idea here, that the stock in this company that the people now own will be held by the people. Now, it's not just an abstract notion. The second important reason for what Senator Alexander is doing here, and Senator Bennett alluded to this, is that it would not be a good financial thing for the United States government to have to sell off all of this stock in a relatively short period of time. And of course, we don't want the government to hold the stock for a long period of time. Why? Because it essentially is a fire sale. Everybody in the market knows the government has to unload 60% of the company, so what are they going to do? Are they going to rush out and pay high dollar for it? No, they're going to pay low dollar for it. The value that the government would get back would not represent the true ultimate value, we believe, of this stock. If it's held, on the other hand, by millions of individual tax-paying Americans, some may want to cash in right away, some may want to hold it, some may want to see. Most will believe there's a significant upside potential, and they may give it to their kids, hold it for a long time. I think, frankly, that's what's going to happen here if the company is run right, and it will be run right with the additions of the Bennett concept to the amendment. So you don't want the government to, in effect, get rid of this stock at fire sale prices. Then nobody benefits. And that's the second very practical reason. We, the people, should have the stock. And secondly, it will make the most sense from a long-term value perspective. And Senator Bennett has spoken to the reasons why the fiduciary responsibility of the government is also very important at play here. I hope that rather than viewing this as some kind of partisan exercise, our Democratic colleagues will listen to their constituents back home who are not happy about the way things are going with government takeovers these days, and will see the value for them in adopting this amendment. This is an amendment, a bill that should be adopted. And I am very hopeful that Democratic colleagues will join us in seeing that that happens.
Any questions?
Senators, have you gotten any reaction from the auto task force or the administration? And is there any concern about the complexity of doing something like this? I don't know how simple or easy it would be to distribute it to that many taxpayers.
Well, the IRS knows where to find us when April 15 comes, so it could find us when it's giving us something. The IRS didn't have much problem with tax rebates. That took a few months. They have the names and addresses and electronic files on about 120 million people who file returns on April 15. It ought to be relatively easy to get stock to them. Typically, in the way stock is handled in America today, the company holds the stock certificates on behalf of the individual owners. So about all you'd have to do is just let the 120 million Americans know you've got a few shares of stock in new GM and Chrysler, and when it's time to sell it, you go through that process. It should be relatively simple.
But any response from the administration? Did you suggest this to them?
I haven't suggested it to the administration. I've been thinking about it for several weeks. It just seems to me to be perfectly obvious. And then when the president of GM made it clear it's the Treasury's decision when they sell the stock according to the way the law is today, but he said it's a very large amount of stock, and as Senator Kyle said, selling it would have to probably be done in stages over a period of years. This could be done in a few months, and we're out of it. It would mean we'd have 120 million or so Americans who own General Motors and Chrysler. That's 60% of GM. The UAW fund owns about 17%. That's non-voting. Government of Canada owns about 12%. The bondholders own the rest. It'd be widely dispersed. It'd be an American company. We'd be back in the way the companies are supposed to operate. And the presidents, instead of driving their hybrids from Detroit to Washington every day to answer some subcommittee's questions about the next car model, could focus on designing and building and selling cars and competing and trying to make the value of the stock go up.
Senator Alexander, with so many auto jobs in your home state, I'm wondering, would you support any legislation that would protect a percentage of those jobs in Tennessee or any other states?
I don't know what kind of legislation would that be. I believe in the free market. I mean, the jobs are in Tennessee. We've gone from having almost no auto jobs to having a third of our manufacturing auto jobs because we're the best competitive place to build cars. We have a right to work law and other states don't. We have low taxes and other states don't. We have one of the best 4-lane highway systems and other states don't. So that's why Nissan has been the most efficient auto plant in America many times, why Volkswagen chose Tennessee, and why I think the Spring Hill plant of GM will be successful.
So you wouldn't support any legislation that would try and make the government protect any of those jobs?
No, I don't. I mean, you can't run the country that way. That's the direction we're headed. I'm trying to go the other way. I'm trying to say let the free market work, get the stock out of Washington so everybody in Washington quits trying to run the car company.
Let me just add. It may be more efficient for GM to downsize their headquarters and move someplace else where it's easier to do business. But the president's quickly on the phone with the mayor of Detroit saying, don't worry, we're going to keep the headquarters right there in Detroit. That's exactly the kind of political decision that has no place in the running of the company for the value of the stockholders.
On jobs, we have the unemployment numbers for May coming out tomorrow. We've seen steady drops in claim numbers, but also in payroll. From where you sit on your states, what are you encouraged by that, and what do you think we're going to see tomorrow?
I won't try to forecast what we're going to see tomorrow. The unemployment problem is, of course, a serious one, and it is a tragic one for those people who have lost their jobs. And I say that as one who has lost my job at various points in my career, and as one who has seen my son lose his job in the financial crisis. And it's a time of great, great difficulty for the individuals and for their families. Fortunately, my son found another job, and I have found another job that I'm trying to keep. That having been said, however, one of the things we have learned is that artificial attempts to maintain employment that go against market forces prolong recessions and sometimes turn them into depressions. And there is evidence with respect to the Great Depression now, as we go back and study that many of the things that were done in the name of protecting jobs in the Great Depression, in fact, caused it to last years longer than it otherwise might have done. You can read the literature on that and come to your own conclusion as to how convincing it may be. The most important thing we must do is get manufacturing and all of those parts of the supply chain that support manufacturing back in a healthy condition again. And it's not just automobiles, it's every portion of the economy that needs to come back. You ask about individual states. In my state, the last time I think we had the unemployment rate, it was 4.8%. I expect it will be higher than that as the recession continues to have its problems. But that's significantly below where it is in many other states. And that underscores the fact that while there are national unemployment rates, they vary dramatically from one region of the country to the other. The recovery is uneven. There are some parts of the country where housing prices have stabilized, and indeed some where they're actually rising. And remember, this whole thing was caused by the bursting of the housing bubble, so that if housing starts to get fixed, that is the most important single thing that can be done to get the recession fixed. There are other parts of the country where the housing prices still are dropping and frankly need to drop before you get stability. So we will look at the national numbers with interest, but the solution to the problem will come from the economy and the actual creation of employment activity region by region.
Would you support doing something like the amendment for AIG as well as,
Support doing something like what?
Like the GM amendment for AIG or some of the other companies that receive a lot of taxpayer money?
I supported the first round of TARP because it was to prevent an international meltdown of the financial system, and I believe it did. And I believe it was justified. I have voted against every other distribution because I disagree with the way they're being managed, and maybe good intentions, but I'm not at all sure that they're going to be as successful as their supporters said they would be.
Any last questions?
Well, yeah, I was actually going to ask the same question.
Well, just
GM
GM is, of course, significantly a stock company. There is other equity and debt. I don't think that's the situation with AIG. I think obviously you'd have to look at it to see, but I don't think that that's the situation there.
I excluded banks from my amendment. The taxpayer owns 60% of the new GM. It will own 8% of Chrysler. That's very straightforward, very simple. We can distribute that to the taxpayers within a matter of months. The bank stocks and warrants that we may own could be more complicated. I wasn't willing to include that as part of this, but I'm studying that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. I agree with his answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.